Countless trains have come and gone over the past 2 centuries, with some classes including hundreds of reliable members in working order, while others have been lost to time as fallen legends or faded into obscurity. Yet the least known type of them all are the various engines that never even left the drawing boards, with some classes being minor adjustments to existing ones, while others were mega projects that would have changed the face of railroading. Today, we'll be looking at some of these canceled designs from some of the greatest manufacturers in this episode of Unbuilt. With one of Alco's largest locomotives currently touring the nation to celebrate the 250th birthday of America, what better way to celebrate the occasion on the channel by covering the next locomotive manufacturer in the series with several unbuilt designs, the American Locomotive Works, or Alco. Because of Alco's several decades-long existence dating back to the late 19th century, this will be the first episode in the series that covers both unbuilt steam and diesel locomotive classes. Since Union Pacific's class of big boy articulated steam engines is one of the most famous creations from Alco's Schenectady plant, we might as well start off with even more articulated steam engines from the neighboring Rio Grande Southern, a recently former subsidiary of the Rio Grande Railroad from roughly 100 years ago. Given the mountainous terrain of the narrow gauge trackage through the Colorado Rockies, the railroad observed the advantages of various articulated narrow gauge locomotives in Europe, and they are interested in bringing the technology over to the States. In response, Alco offered the Rio Grande Southern the L57 class, a 2882 articulated narrow gauge engine which offered 54,000 pounds of tractive effort, as well as the same cylinders, axle loads, springs, and driver wheels as the Rio Grande K27s, essentially being two permanently coupled K27s. Despite being made as a response to two similar proposed Rio Grande narrow gauge articulated designs from the rivaling Baldwin, none of these classes were ever built, due to the Rio Grande Southern in itself barely having enough money to purchase new engines as it is, let alone after splitting up from the Rio Grande during the Great Depression when the design was proposed. Over the years, the Rio Grande Southern wouldn't be the only railroad to propose articulated designs for Alco to build, such as the neighboring Burlington routes, or rather Colorado and Southern's proposed duplex, or 4444, this time with driver wheels riding on a single frame. In fact, the driving wheels proved to be this design's ultimate downfall, as the proposed 80-inch driver wheels proved to be too big and impractical for the railroad, as even though Alco proposed shrinking the driver wheel size to 76 inches, the railroad was more interested in more traditional locomotives by this point. Other railroads in the meantime did have more success with variations of duplex designs, notably the Pennsylvania Railroad with their S1, Q2, and most notably their T1s. But even they had at least one design intended for Alco, which was ultimately rejected, as the Pennsy itself will eventually have its own episode in the series, with one of their many proposed designs including a 4446, referred to in 1937 drawings as the Alco 530 class. Other than the tenders, there aren't many differences between the two proposed designs, other than the use of a 6-axle trailing truck instead of a 4-axle one, in order to account for the firebox weight. This was one of the earlier design solutions offered to the Pennsy to supplement their smaller K4 Pacifics in longer distance passenger and freight runs, but the role would ultimately be filled by the more prominent T1 duplexes from the rivaling Baldwin Locomotive Works, in order to race against the rivaling New York Central on New York to Chicago passenger trains. Speaking of the Central, they too would propose their own duplex designs, as the New York Central proposed a duplex variant of their successful Alco Niagara steam engines, classified as the C1A. This design would essentially split the Niagara's rigid wheelbase into two sets of driver wheels, and would also use Baker valve gear with lightweight piston valves instead of poppet valves with a grate area between 102 and 104 square feet. In order to allow for Harmon to Chicago through running without refueling, the tender capacity would have been increased from 55 to 64 tons, therefore requiring another rear guide axle, as the C1A would have been 10 feet longer and 20,000 pounds heavier than the Niagara. Even though no exact builder was specified, it's assumed that Alco would construct the C1A, seeing how Alco also built the Niagaras, although this proposal was designed as late as 1945, as by this time, EMD units already proved their worth to the railroads and were ushering in the age of dieselization, thus making any steam locomotive proposals past this time a moot point. And to bring the steam section full circle, Union Pacific wanted to undergo a similar program with their equally powerful 9000 class series of steam engines by converting them into articulated 4662s, but this too was canned due to the high cost of the project during the Great Depression, in addition to the railroad already having several other already strong freight engines. Additionally, the same railroad also proposed a similar 410-4 Lincoln type in 1927. This engine would have 3 cylinders with 73-inch drivers and 240 psi boiler pressure, resulting in 7,000 horsepower thanks to its large side rods. Although Union Pacific ultimately opted to develop their 484 Northern engines instead, as they ultimately opted for the 800 series of steam engines, which would later lead to the much more successful FEF series about a decade later. By that time, dieselization was slowly making its way into American mainstream, and locomotive manufacturers had to adapt to the new technology accordingly. In addition to making great steam engines, Alco was also an excellent builder of diesels and gave the diesel-exclusive EMD and GE a run for their money. Just like their steam locomotive run, Alco would also roster a number of various diesel designs over the decades that never left the drawing boards, even towards the beginning of Alco's diesel building career, starting off with when they were in a consortium with General Electric and Ingersoll Rand, known together as AGEIR. Even though most diesels built during this time were known as Alco box cabs, with the 60-ton and 100-ton engines being some of the first diesels constructed for switching use on larger railroads in the 1910s, there were plans to construct a 108-ton box cab, which offered 750 horsepower. Though several 100-ton and 600 horsepower box cabs were reported to weigh 108 tons upon completion, depending on various road specifications. Other early diesel era entries include the class HH150 and HH400, or E1400 and E1503 respectively, for their crankshaft models. These simply would have just been additional entries in the HH series of early Alco switchers produced in the 1930s, this time offering 150 horsepower and 400 horsepower respectively, with their visual appearances supposedly being identical to the HH600. Given the low horsepower as denoted in the name, the HH150 would have been one of the weakest locomotive classes in the US, as its uses would have been limited to small industrial shunting duties, where only a few cars have to be moved at a time. There are also claims that there would have been an E411, which would have been an 800 horsepower center cab switcher of sorts, which could have the same appearance as the HH series, but no known information seems to be available of this class, nor is it confirmed that Alco ever offered this model. There are also designs from industrial designer Otto Kohler around this time, which included an unknown 442 with a cab at the front of the steam engine, somewhat reminiscent of early streamlined diesel rail cars, and another design that resembles a Baltimore and Ohio streamlined diesel railcar set, though it's unclear if these designs were intended for any specific railroad, or builder for that matter. But back to the big picture for Alco. Some of these classes are relatively small modifications to existing classes, such as the SSB-1 and SSB-2, which would have just been calf or slug units for their S1 and S2 class of switchers respectively, basically providing extra horsepower for switching long lines of freight cars in large yards. Other entries include continuations of existing series, such as the PA3 and FA4, the next iterations of the Alco PA passenger engine and Alco FA freight engine, designed to directly rival EMD's E and F series diesels. The PA3s would have offered 2,400 horsepower when compared to the PA2's 2,250 horsepower, though by this time the market for new passenger engines was likely starting to slow down, resulting in no buyers for the PA3. Meanwhile, the FA4 would have used the V12 251 engine to produce 1,800 horsepower, though this model never received any orders due to car body units and Alco products both falling out of favor by railroads. The same can also be said about the proposed FP3, FP6, FPC6, FP7, and FPC7, as all of these were Canadian counterparts of the Alco FA, intended for passenger and freight service. Fast forward a few years, and Alco starts to shift their focus more on road freight diesels, as the first of these road switcher entries is actually from Montreal Locomotive Works, or MLW, who was licensed to produce Canadian counterparts of Alco's, starting off with the RS-13. Surprisingly, this class got as far as the operator's manual, with its own prototype unit being built in 1956, if it weren't for one little footnote in the manual. Next to the RS-13 name is an asterisk, which correlates to a sentence that reads, "This locomotive may also be equipped with a 6-wheel 4-motor truck," which is precisely the engine that's shown in this manual, and ended up being built. But because this class has a 6-axle truck, that would therefore make it an RSC-13, standing for Road Switcher with Unpowered Third Axle Model number 13, with the real RS-13 more than likely just being a 4-truck variant of the RSC-13, which was simply never ordered due to the increased stability of 3-axle trucks for longer distance freight service that these engines were used on. Is what I would have said if it weren't for a few of these engines later being converted with 4-axle trucks at some point in the 60s while on Canadian National, as they were in fact reclassified to RS-13s to reflect the new trucks. So this class name was originally offered but had no initial orders placed, only for it to actually exist about 10 years later due to a second-hand conversion. So does that make the original RS-13 class unbuilt? I feel like I'm being gaslit with this one. Anyways, now on to the next several entries that have practically no information on them, other than reasonable assumptions that they're cataloged 4-axle and 6-axle counterparts to existing engines. Specifically, the RSD-1B would have likely been either a 4-axle or a B unit of the RSD-1, the RSC-11 would have been the 6-axle variant of the Alco RS-11, the RSC-23 would have been the 6-axle variant of the MLW RS-23, and the RS-24 would have been the 4-axle variant of the MLW RSC-24. The next 4 entries, however, don't have a 4 or 6-axle counterpart, nor does there appear to be any information about them online, so the best we can do for now is to interpolate similarities with adjacent classes. It is therefore assumed for the purpose of this video that the RS-19 will be the most similar to the MLW RS-18, the RS-21 will be the most similar to the MLW RS-23, the RSX-22 would have been the next iteration of the RSX-4, though it's not known if this class was actually proposed or not. The RS-28 would be the most similar to the RS-27, and the RSC-38 would be the most similar to the RS-36, this time with 6 axles. Coming back to different axle counts, the RSD-33 is a class that we thankfully do know a good deal about, as this engine got so far into production that it also had its own operator's manual made for it, mostly because it was simply a 6-axle counterpart of the existing RS-32 model produced in 1961, with roughly all internal components being identical to the 4-axle counterpart. Some claim that the RSD-33 was intended for export use since its 6 axles would better distribute the weight and provide better stability on smaller tracks, though this engine could have also been offered in the States for the same reason. But both the RSD-33 and the RS-32s were victims of bad timing, as even though most railroads wanted versatile 4-axle road switchers starting in the late 50s, most railroads already purchased other Alco or EMD road switchers, as the RS-32 only sold a measly 35 units, and likewise 0 units for the RSD-33. And while we're at it, Alco also made a wide number of export units for several railroads around the world, whose differences from their American counterparts varied, though their cancelled classes were similarly just existing classes with different trucks. Specifically, the RSC-8 is an A1A version of the DL-151, or RSD-8. The RSC-31 is an A1A version of the DL-534, or RSD-39. The RSD-31 is a C version of the DL-534. The C-515 is an 8-251 prime mover version of the DL-531. The RS-20 is a BB version of the DL-541, or RSD-16. And lastly, the RSC-20 is an A1A version of the DL-541. Shortly after the end of the Road Switcher or RS series, was the next evolution of Alco's competition against the rivaling EMD and GE, the introduction of the Century series. Among the first of the Century series, announced in 1963, was the C624, a 6-axle 2400 horsepower diesel engine as denoted by the class name, which was offered alongside the 4-axle C420 and C424. Seeing how the 6-axle locomotive was offering the exact same horsepower as its 4-axle counterpart, no orders were placed for the C624 due to the aforementioned versatility benefits of 4-axle power. But recognizing this, the C624 was quickly replaced with the C628, so this way more horsepower was being offered in exchange for the extra pair of axles. There was also a C620 offered at one point, in which it would utilize the same frame as the C628, but offer 800 less horsepower than the C628. If Alco didn't gain enough sales to justify a C624, then I don't know how they could pull off selling a 6-axle locomotive for even less horsepower than the other 4-axle engines in the catalog, especially seeing how EMD and GE also had little to no sales for lower horsepower 6-axle engines. Also, as a side note, among all the railroads that Alco contacted to try to sell this engine, somehow they reached out to the Cambria in Indiana, a small short-line railroad in the middle of Pennsylvanian Appalachian Mountains, and offered them the C620 in an attempt to replace their existing diesels, only to end up being rejected by the remote railroad in favor of the EMD SW1500. Like, dang, that's embarrassing. Like, how do you lose to an engine half the size of yours? Anyways, now for the exact opposite story with the next Century. Whereas the C620 packs too little horsepower and too large a car body, the C428 offered too much horsepower and too little of a car body, specifically 2750 horsepower, which was almost 400 more than the previous two 4-axle models offered. Even though this engine would have used the same prime mover as the 6-axle counterpart, it would have required more complex wiring for the DC powered generators in order to account for the extra power required for the engine. Instead of overcomplicating what was supposed to be a simpler and low maintenance design, Alco eventually decided to replace the C428 with the C430, a 4-axle diesel that offered AC powered generators, with another 200 horsepower and actual sales of the class in return. There are also rumors floating about of a C436, which would have been 3600 horsepower packed on the 4 axles, but there don't appear to be any official records of Alco offering such a class, and if they did, it's also unknown if they would have had the same space issues as the C428. Now for stories that follow none of the previous few, such as the C410, which doesn't have a lot of info on it in the first place, though it's speculated that this simply would have been a lower horsepower version of the C415, a unique switcher that had low sales to begin with, so you can probably imagine how well trying to sell a lower horsepower version of a niche class of engines went. Speaking of niche topics, the once mighty passenger locomotive industry was starting to become a niche due to competition from cars and planes, with the last-ditch effort of making dedicated passenger engines by the Big Three around the same time as when Alco was developing their Century series. Despite the overall decline in interstate passenger rail across the country, the greater New York commuter rail market still managed to stay afloat, with several similar orders for commuter rail engines being placed by several railroads. Alco decided to pursue this market as well with the C430P, which would have simply been a C430 with high-speed gearing and a steam generator that could easily be converted for freight service in the event of passenger services ceasing on the railroad that it was used for. The railroad in pursuit, the Central Railroad in New Jersey, or CNJ. The competition, the GP40P, built with the same specifications, but this time as an EMD GP40 instead of an Alco C430. That and the parent railroad of the Jersey Central, the Baltimore and Ohio, insisted that CNJ select EMD for the order due to fleet compatibility with their other recently purchased EMD freight engines, thus placing the C430P at a disadvantageous position in the race for Jersey Central. But that's not to say that Alco didn't try to put in one last effort in the interstate passenger rail engine market as well. Whereas EMD had the FP45 and GE had the U30CG, Alco naturally put their hat in the ring with the C636P, a streamlined cowl unit version of the C636 freight engine that, just like its competitors, could also easily be converted for freight service. Though it's not known which railroads expressed interest in such an engine, this is definitely one of Alco's more iconic and recognizable unbuilt locomotive classes due to a famous drawing of a Southern Pacific C636P pulling a string of various coaches, implying that if built, it would have made it into Amtrak's early days. Ironically, the Southern Pacific tested a regular Alco C636 a few years prior, with the traction motors burning out on 3 of 4 test runs on the SP, which discouraged the railroad from making more Alco purchases. Similarly, the C636F was offered as a full cow-body version of the C636 at the request of the Santa Fe Railroad, who also purchased cow unit freight engines from the other big two, which also came in the form of a B unit. But just like the proposed passenger variant, this order was ultimately cancelled due to both the unreliability of the regular C636 and also the disadvantageous full cowling car body, which complicated maintenance. Also offered around this time was a similar C640, this time with just 400 extra horsepower and offered by MLW, according to some concept art, likely generating no results for the same aforementioned reasons. Although, this particular design would eventually evolve into the MLW M640, which did end up being purchased by Canadian Pacific, and then proceeded to be one of the worst performing engines in MLW's history with just one unit built. Speaking of a one-of-a-kind engine that performed horribly, Alco also cataloged a C860, which would have been the next iteration of the C855 series of engines, which itself was a unique experimental ABA set for Union Pacific to test alongside other experimental one-off classes from EMD and GE in 1964, namely the DD35A and U50. In addition to trying to pack more horsepower into one locomotive instead of using several, aluminum wiring was the ultimate selling point of the C855 to save costs, but this ultimately led to backwards wiring, overheating, electrical fires, and constantly shutting down thanks to its twin prime movers, resulting in just 8 years of service. So this begs the question, would the C860 also have used aluminum wires and continue the legacy of being Alco's next worst produced locomotive? Most likely yes, as technical specifications for the C860 appear to be almost identical to the C855, especially with regards to the electrical info. This means that the C860 was most likely offered during the same time as the C855 and before said engine ran on Union Pacific, meaning Alco wouldn't have learned their lesson yet and therefore would have still offered the C860 with aluminum wiring. But the twin prime mover class with aluminum wiring wouldn't be the only low production experimental class that Alco produced in 1964 for a railroad with Pacific in the name, as this builder would dabble into the world of diesel hydraulic engines with their C643DH, or DH643, with 3 members being built for the Southern Pacific. Unlike anything else from Alco, or anything else in the Unbuilt series, these 3 locomotives were powered by German voiced diesel hydraulic prime movers, whose combinations of being difficult to operate as well as relying on German-made parts, leading to these 3 engines also having a service life of just 8 years. But whereas the C860 would have just been one follow-up order to the C855, Alco was planning on releasing several classes of diesel hydraulic engines, notably with this DH650, or 650DH, which would have simply been the next iteration of the DH643 by offering an extra 700 horsepower. Yet this was far from the only diesel hydraulic class offered by Alco, mostly at the request of the Southern Pacific, as they also developed a DH660, which would have offered another extra 1000 horsepower. Other classes include a C433DH, or G3300BB, which, as denoted by the name, would have been a 4-axle 3300 horsepower locomotive. Also included in Alco's line of proposed diesel hydraulics are the RHD1 and RHD2, or DH400 and DH401, as even though the DH400 was also an alternative name for the DH643, with little info known about the class name, the DH401 would have been powered by British licensed Paxman V12 prime movers instead of German voice engines. And after all that, we have the most obscure Alco class of them all, the RD1, or DL840, not to be confused with the RD1 turbocharger which GE made for various Alco engines. Though the only source I could find for this class seems to suggest that the RD1 would have been a Russian export variant of the Alco RSD1, but this time with 6 axles, even though the RSD1 wouldn't have had 6 axles to begin with? Or maybe this does have something to do with the GE turbochargers. Speaking of GE, the company would eventually split from Alco in the mid-50s to start making their own diesel locomotives, due to Alco themselves always playing second fiddle to the rivaling EMD when it came to diesel sales, thus leaving Alco to fend for themselves with decreasing quality for their locomotives. With a major part of their locomotive production gone, and now trailing in third place in the diesel locomotive builder race, the mighty Alco was ultimately forced to end production of their diesel locomotives outright in 1969. Though the story of Alco continues with honorable mentions, starting off with a brief step back in time to Ingalls shipbuilding. Many of you might be wondering why the shipbuilding company was included in this episode, since they only produced a single locomotive. This is because they also released an entire brochure for post-locomotive classes in 1949, and as luck would have it, some of them just so happen to look like existing Alco classes, so might as well cover them now. The 3S would have been identical to the existing 4S, that was 500 less horsepower and was not intended for passenger service. The 5S and 16S were yard switchers that offered 1,600 horsepower and look almost identical to the Alco S series. And the 17A is the most unique, as this 6-axle streamliner offered 2,000 horsepower and bared more resemblance to a Baldwin cab unit. Ingalls started their locomotive run with a single demonstrator of the 4S road switcher in 1946 and tested it with several other railroads in the South, but sadly not a single order was placed for any other Ingalls model, likely due to the 4S not being intended for one specific duty, its cowl design starting to fall out of favor, and that Ingalls had no prior experience to building diesels and couldn't take on the dominant EMD along with several other new diesel builders at the time. Now back to the main story. Even though Alco themselves went defunct in 1969, their Canadian counterpart, Montreal Locomotive Works, ended up buying the models from Alco outright and still produced various classes of engines until 1985. Among these engines were also 2 cancelled classes, namely the M427 and the M430, which, as denoted by their class names, likely would have simply been 2,700 and 3,000 horsepower versions of the MLW M420 M-liners constructed a few years after Alco's shutdown, as these classes were never constructed due to having too much horsepower for the small duties that the M-liners were used for. Interestingly enough, MLW would then be purchased shortly thereafter by Bombardier, a Canadian aerospace manufacturer, who would also propose several unbuilt classes, notably in the high reliability or HR series. This includes the HR416, a 3,200 horsepower version of the existing HR412, the HR618, a 3,600 horsepower version of the existing HR616, and the HR406, which rather unusually would be an upgraded Alco S13, more similar in appearance to the M420TR. In addition to export models MX412, MX415, and MX612, which likely would have been loosely based on their Canadian counterparts. But by 1985, Bombardier would cease locomotive production in favor of rolling stock and aircraft, only to eventually be purchased by Alstom in 2020, with the MLW plant being purchased by GE before shutting down less than a decade later. Yet despite this quiet departure, several Alco and MLW diesels are still running in tour service and even in revenue service to this day, as even though many classes from these builders weren't fully constructed, it goes to show the longevity and reliability of engines built by one of the greatest locomotive manufacturers in American railroading history. Are there any little-known Alco, MLW, or Bombardier locomotives that I didn't include in this video? Feel free to let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching. Credit for all the photo SKUs goes for their respective photographers, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Have a good day.